Before the telephone existed, human communication over distance was slow, fragmented, and limited by physical constraints. For most of history, messages traveled only as fast as the fastest horse, ship, or human messenger. Distance meant delay, distortion, and often complete silence. The invention of the telegraph in the early 19th century changed this reality dramatically. Using electrical signals transmitted through wires, the telegraph allowed coded messages to travel almost instantly across vast distances. For the first time, information could outrun transportation. This innovation reshaped commerce, diplomacy, and warfare. However, the telegraph had a critical limitation: it did not transmit the human voice. Messages had to be encoded in Morse code, sent as pulses, and decoded by trained operators at the receiving end. Communication became faster, but also more abstract. Emotion, tone, and nuance were lost in translation. By the mid-1800s, inventors around the world were asking the same question: could electricity carry not just signals, but sound itself? This question would ignite one of the most intense invention races in history. At the heart of the problem was sound. Sound is a vibration, pressure waves moving through air. To transmit sound electrically, those vibrations would need to be converted into electrical variations, sent through a wire, and then reconstructed as sound on the other end. This was not an obvious task. Electricity, at the time, was poorly understood. Components were crude. Amplification did not yet exist. Even the idea that a continuous electrical signal could vary smoothly to match sound waves was controversial. Despite these challenges, many inventors believed it was possible. One of them was Antonio Meucci. Meucci was an Italian immigrant living in the United States. Long before Alexander Graham Bell entered the picture, Meucci had been experimenting with devices designed to transmit voice electrically. By the early 1850s, he had built working prototypes that allowed voice communication over short distances. Meucci called his invention the teletrafono. His motivation was deeply personal. His wife was ill and often confined to her bedroom. Meucci wanted a way to communicate with her from his workshop without shouting or running back and forth. His experiments were practical, not theoretical. By 1860, Meucci demonstrated voice transmission to witnesses. He documented his work and attempted to secure legal protection. However, Meucci was poor. Patent fees were expensive, and the American patent system required ongoing payments to maintain a claim. Meucci filed a caveat, a temporary notice of invention intent, in 1871. This caveat described a voice communication system using electricity. However, he was unable to afford the renewal fee. The caveat lapsed. This single financial limitation would change history. Meucci also faced language barriers, limited business connections, and a lack of institutional support. He attempted to interest companies in his invention, including Western Union. According to later testimony, some of his materials were lost or ignored. As a result, Meucci's work remained largely invisible. He was not alone. Throughout the 1860s and early 1870s, inventors across Europe and America were experimenting with harmonic telegraphs. These devices aimed to send multiple telegraph messages simultaneously over a single wire by using different frequencies or tones. The logic was simple: if electrical signals could vary in frequency, perhaps they could vary continuously enough to reproduce sound. Among those working on harmonic telegraphs was a young Scottish-born inventor named Alexander Graham Bell. Bell was not initially trying to invent the telephone. His primary focus was on sound itself, particularly speech and hearing. Bell came from a family deeply involved in elocution and speech education. His father developed a system called visible speech, designed to teach pronunciation by visually representing speech sounds. Bell's mother was deaf, and later, his wife would be as well. These personal experiences shaped his obsession with sound, voice, and human communication. Bell worked as a teacher for the deaf, studying how speech could be broken down into mechanical and acoustic components. This background gave him a unique perspective: he understood sound not just as a phenomenon, but as a system. By the early 1870s, Bell was living in the United States and working on a harmonic telegraph. His goal was to send multiple messages over a single wire, which would make telegraph systems far more efficient and profitable. This brought him into contact with investors and institutions that were eager to improve telegraphy, particularly Western Union. Bell's experiments led him to an unexpected realization. If an electrical current could be made to vary continuously in response to sound vibrations, it might be possible to transmit actual speech. This idea was not entirely new. Others had suggested it. But Bell pursued it with intensity. Crucially, Bell was not working alone. He collaborated closely with Thomas Watson, a skilled machinist and technician. Watson built and refined Bell's experimental devices, translating abstract ideas into physical apparatus. Their partnership was essential. At the same time, another inventor was pursuing a similar path. Elisha Gray was an accomplished electrical engineer and co-founder of what would later become Western Electric. Gray was deeply involved in harmonic telegraph research. Like Bell, he recognized that continuous electrical variation could transmit sound. Gray developed designs for a liquid transmitter, a device that used a conductive fluid to modulate electrical current in response to sound vibrations. His experiments produced promising results. By early 1876, both Bell and Gray were extremely close to transmitting intelligible speech electrically. What happened next would become one of the most controversial moments in patent history. Because on a single day, February 14, 1876, two documents were submitted to the United States Patent Office. One was a full patent application. The other was a caveat. They described remarkably similar ideas. And only one name would enter the history books. February 14, 1876, is one of the most consequential dates in the history of technology. On that day, the future of voice communication would be decided, not in a laboratory, but inside the United States Patent Office in Washington, D.C. On the surface, it appeared to be an ordinary Monday. Clerks processed documents. Inventors submitted filings. Paperwork moved from desk to desk. But behind the scenes, two inventions describing nearly the same revolutionary idea arrived within hours of each other. The first submission was a patent application from Alexander Graham Bell. The second was a caveat from Elisha Gray. To understand why this mattered so much, it is important to understand how the patent system worked at the time. A patent application was a full legal claim, describing an invention in detail and asserting exclusive rights. A caveat, on the other hand, was a temporary notice, a declaration that an inventor was working on an idea and intended to file a full patent later. A caveat did not grant ownership, but it could establish priority if another application conflicted with it. On February 14, Bell's attorney filed a complete patent application titled Improvement in Telegraphy. The language was broad, technical, and carefully constructed. It did not explicitly use the word telephone, but it described a method of transmitting vocal sounds by causing electrical currents to vary continuously in intensity. Just hours later, Elisha Gray's attorney filed a caveat describing a remarkably similar concept. Gray's document specifically mentioned a liquid transmitter, an apparatus in which a diaphragm vibrated in contact with a conductive fluid, producing electrical variations that corresponded to sound waves. The overlap was impossible to ignore. The critical question was simple but explosive: who got there first? Official records indicate that Bell's application was logged earlier in the day than Gray's caveat. This timing would later become central to Bell's claim. But the controversy does not end there. Shortly after the filings, Bell's application was reviewed by a patent examiner named Zenas Fisk Wilbur. Wilbur noticed the similarity between Bell's claims and Gray's caveat. Under normal circumstances, this would trigger a formal interference proceeding to determine priority. Instead, something unusual happened. Bell's application was allowed to proceed, with amendments. Over the following weeks, Bell's patent application was revised. Notably, language was added that more clearly described the variable resistance method used in liquid transmitters, the very approach outlined in Gray's caveat. This detail would haunt Bell's legacy. Years later, Wilbur himself would provide a sworn affidavit stating that he had improperly discussed Gray's caveat with Bell's attorney. Wilbur claimed he was struggling financially and accepted money from Bell's side. While his testimony was later challenged and partially retracted, it added fuel to an already raging controversy. Regardless of intent, the outcome was clear. On March 7, 1876, Alexander Graham Bell was granted U.S. Patent Number 174,465. This patent is often described as the most valuable patent ever issued. Just 3 days later, on March 10, Bell famously spoke the first intelligible words transmitted electrically, "Mr. Watson, come here, I want to see you." This moment became legend. But even this milestone is not as straightforward as it appears. The apparatus used in that first successful transmission relied on principles very close to Gray's liquid transmitter design. Bell himself would later move away from liquid transmitters entirely, favoring electromagnetic designs. But the legal foundation had already been laid. Elisha Gray, for his part, chose not to pursue a full legal challenge immediately. He was deeply involved with Western Union and focused on other projects. This decision would prove costly. Meanwhile, Bell's backers moved quickly. Bell was not acting alone. He had powerful supporters who understood the commercial potential of the telephone. His patents were transferred to newly formed companies that would eventually become the Bell Telephone Company. Western Union, initially dismissive of Bell, soon realized the telephone's value. But by then, Bell's patents stood in the way. What followed was a legal war unlike anything seen before in American technology. Dozens of inventors came forward, claiming prior invention. Antonio Meucci resurfaced, asserting that Bell had built upon ideas he had demonstrated years earlier. Others pointed to European experiments and forgotten patents. Over the next 2 decades, the Bell Telephone Company would face more than 600 lawsuits. And it would win almost all of them. The strength of Bell's position did not come solely from technical superiority. It came from legal strategy, financial power, and relentless defense of intellectual property. The Bell Company hired the best lawyers, controlled key infrastructure, and aggressively enforced its patents. Courts repeatedly upheld Bell's claims, often citing the breadth and wording of his original patent rather than the specific devices used. Bell's patent was interpreted not as a single mechanism, but as ownership over the concept of transmitting speech electrically. This interpretation was extraordinary. It meant that even inventors who developed different technical solutions could be found infringing if their systems achieved the same result. Elisha Gray eventually withdrew from the fight. Antonio Meucci's claims were acknowledged in testimony, but dismissed due to lack of formal patents. Meucci died poor and largely forgotten. Bell, meanwhile, became one of the most powerful figures in American industry. Yet doubts never fully disappeared. Historians, engineers, and legal scholars continued to question how Bell's patent could have been granted in such sweeping terms. The timing, the amendments, and the examiner's later statements created a shadow that never entirely faded. The question was no longer simply who invented the telephone first. The question became whether the patent system had rewarded invention, or influence. And the consequences were enormous. Because the telephone was not just another device. It would become the backbone of global communication, shaping business, politics, and daily life for generations. The decision made in 1876 locked control of that future into the hands of a single corporate entity. And that control would last for decades. By the late 1870s, the telephone was no longer an experiment. It was becoming an industry. And with that transformation came a level of legal and corporate warfare rarely seen before in the history of technology. Alexander Graham Bell himself was no longer the central figure in the fight. The battle had shifted from inventors to corporations. The Bell Telephone Company, backed by investors and elite legal teams, took control of Bell's patents and made defending them its highest priority. What followed was a legal campaign of unprecedented scale. Over the next several decades, the Bell Telephone Company would be involved in more than 600 lawsuits related to telephone patents. These cases were brought against rival inventors, small companies, and even major corporations attempting to enter the telephone market. The core of Bell's legal power rested on a single idea, that his 1876 patent did not merely describe a device, but claimed ownership over the concept of transmitting human speech electrically. Courts repeatedly upheld this interpretation. Judges ruled that even if other inventors had developed different mechanisms, if the result was electrical transmission of voice, Bell's patent applied. This effectively granted Bell's company a monopoly over telephone technology in the United States. From a legal standpoint, it was a stunning victory. From a historical standpoint, it was deeply controversial. Among the many challengers was Antonio Meucci. Long after Bell's patent had been granted, Meucci came forward with evidence of his earlier work. Witnesses testified that Meucci had demonstrated voice transmission years before Bell. Documents showed that he had filed a caveat describing a speaking telegraph. However, the courts ruled against him. Meucci's caveat had expired. He lacked a full patent. His prototypes were gone. His financial situation prevented him from mounting a sustained legal challenge. In the eyes of the law, priority was not about who invented first, it was about who successfully navigated the system. Meucci died in 1889, poor and unrecognized. Elisha Gray fared better financially but lost the historical battle. Though he was widely respected as an engineer, his decision to file a caveat rather than a full patent on February 14, 1876, proved fatal to his claim. In the unforgiving logic of patent law, caution was punished. Gray would later express regret, acknowledging that he had been closer to success than he realized. Bell, meanwhile, became a symbol. He was celebrated as a heroic inventor, a visionary who changed the world. His name became synonymous with the telephone itself. Schools, institutions, and awards bore his name. The Bell system grew into one of the most powerful monopolies in American history. Yet Bell's personal role in later years was complex. He did not spend his life defending telephone patents. Instead, he moved on to other interests: aviation, hydrofoils, genetics, and education. He remained intellectually curious and scientifically engaged. Those who knew him described him as sincere and deeply interested in human communication. This complicates the narrative. Bell was not a cartoon villain. He did not personally sue hundreds of inventors. He did not personally orchestrate every legal maneuver. Much of the aggressive patent enforcement was driven by corporate interests acting in his name. This raises the central question of the story. Was Alexander Graham Bell a genius? Undeniably, yes. He was a brilliant thinker with a deep understanding of sound, speech, and communication. His work with the deaf shaped his insights in ways few engineers could replicate. Was he a thief? That answer is less clear. There is no definitive proof that Bell deliberately stole another inventor's designs. However, the timing of events, the similarities between filings, and the amendments to his patent create legitimate doubts. At minimum, Bell benefited enormously from a system that favored speed, influence, and legal positioning over pure originality. Or was he something else entirely? Perhaps Bell was a product of his time. The late 19th century was an era when invention was inseparable from capitalism. Ideas alone were not enough. To survive, inventors needed funding, legal protection, and institutional backing. Those who lacked these resources, even if they were first, were often erased. In this context, Bell did not invent the telephone alone. The telephone emerged from a crowded field of inventors, each contributing pieces of the puzzle. Meucci explored voice transmission early. Gray refined technical solutions. Bell unified concepts, filed strategically, and had the support to defend his claim. History chose Bell not because the story was simple, but because it was convenient. For more than a century, textbooks told a clean narrative: one man, one invention, one moment of genius. The reality was messier, more human, and more uncomfortable. In 2002, the United States Congress passed a resolution recognizing Antonio Meucci's contributions to the development of the telephone. While largely symbolic, it was an acknowledgement that the traditional story was incomplete. But symbolism does not rewrite memory. Bell remains the name most associated with the telephone. Meucci remains a footnote. Gray is remembered mainly by specialists. The patent system, meanwhile, stands unchanged, still rewarding those who move fastest and defend hardest. The story of the telephone is not just about who invented it. It is about how invention is claimed, how credit is assigned, and how history is shaped by power as much as by ideas. In that sense, the telephone war is not unique. It is a pattern repeated across innovation, from radio to flight, from electricity to computing. Visionaries imagine the future. Institutions decide who owns it. So was Alexander Graham Bell a genius, a thief, or both? The most honest answer may be this. He was a genius who won. And in the history of technology, that often makes all the difference.